Well, this morning, both in worship and in ABC, we're kicking off this new series, and the title of the series, technically, it is just one letter. It is the little letter I. That's the name of the series, I. Now, my guess is, if you use electronic devices at all, when you see the little letter I, something immediately comes to mind, because Apple, the company, has built a whole empire off of this one little letter. Most ubiquitously, we got the Apple iPhone. Got one right here in my pocket. Another thing that Apple has a lot of are iPads, and I actually have my ABC notes this morning on this iPad. Several years ago, the big deal was the iPod, where you could listen to all your favorite music. And then, of course, their big desktop computer, it is called the iMac. And as different as all these devices may be, they have one essential goal, and the goal is this. They want to help your everyday life run just a little bit smoother. They want to help you be just a little bit more productive. And the secret behind these devices is that they are, to a great extent, customizable. If you have an iPod, you can download pretty much any song that you could ever want to listen to on that iPod, songs that are just for you. If you have an iPad or an iPhone, you can download pretty much any kind of app that you would ever want, apps that are just for you. In fact, I was looking at some of the strangest apps out there. One is called Carmady, and that's the app symbol, just in case you want to get it. And the nice thing about Carmady is that it will tell you where you parked your car if you forgot where you parked it. Now, that sounds kind of useful, right? Anybody ever park their car and then not be able to find their car? If you just drop a little pin, it'll tell you where you parked your car. But here's the deal. The strange thing about this app is that it tells you in a pirate voice. That's the reason it is literally called Carmady, okay? Another app that is kind of strange. This is called RunPee. I know that's a weird name. Here's the way this works. You ever been to a movie and you think you're getting to a really good part in the movie and then nature calls? Okay, this app will tell you the best times during a movie to go use the restroom. Real app out there. Oh yeah, nothing's going to happen during this part. You can go and run and use the restroom. No problem. Kind of a weird app. I don't know if anybody would want to use it, but just in case, it might be kind of helpful. Another app out there, this one is called Yo. This app does one thing. You open it, you know what it says? Yo. Does it do anything else? No. That's all it does. Not quite sure why that's useful, but there's an app for that too as well. Now, as I said, I'm not sure how useful any of these apps would be, but if they're helpful to you, you can download them, which is part of what has made Apple so incredibly successful, because Apple is all about you. They're all about I. Okay, here's the question that we're going to be asking in this series, and here's the reason that we're calling this series Little Letter I. Your devices, they may be devoted to you. But how about you? What are you devoted to? Your devices, they may be all about you, but how about you? What are you all about? If your life was reduced down to one letter or one symbol, what would that letter or what would that symbol be? You know, a lot of people devote their lives to a lot of different things. For some people, if they had a symbol, their symbol might be this: devoted to cash. They're all about getting money, keeping money, earning more of it, increasing money. Other people, their symbol may be something like this. They like to party. Work is just something you do in between weekends, right? For other people, their symbol may be something like this. You got a favorite sport. Mine happens to be football, but you got a favorite sport, and you know what? That's what you live for. You follow your team, and you are their biggest fan. What is it that defines you? What is it that you're devoted to? What are you all about? Now, I'll tell you what, as we get going, there's an interesting paradox in the Christian faith. And the paradox is this: the less devoted that you are to you and the stuff that surrounds you, your money, your relaxation, your team, just yourself, the less devoted you are to you, the more you become. Let me say that again. This is the paradox of the Christian faith. The less you are devoted to you, the more you become. Pastor read this in his message during worship. The Apostle Paul explains it like this. Philippians 3, beginning at verse 7, Paul says, "Whatever were gains to me, whatever it was I defined myself by, I now consider a loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. I consider all that stuff garbage, that I may gain Jesus and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Jesus Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. Here's what Paul is saying. Paul says that when we define ourselves, by the affinities that we have, by the stuff that we do, by the money that we make, by the sports team that we follow, by the job that we land, by the accolades that we achieve, when we define ourselves by ourselves, you know what we wind up doing? We wind up destroying ourselves. That's what always happens. We wind up destroying ourselves usually in one of three ways. Number one, we can destroy ourselves by becoming very arrogant. Because somehow we do something that we see other people have not done, and therefore we think that we are better than them. We think that we are richer, we are smarter, we are more moral, we are more endearing, we are more whatever than everybody else, and we become arrogant. And so we define ourselves by being better than somebody else. Nobody wants to be around a person like that. You're just destroying yourself. Then again, if you define yourself by yourself, the other way you can destroy yourself is by launching yourself into despair. Because you have something that you use to define yourself, and then you lose that something, and you know what you also lose? Yourself. You have a lot of money, and you lose a lot of money, and you wind up in despair. You have a great job, and you lose that great job, and you wind up in despair. Why? Because that is what you've used to define yourself, and as soon as you don't have that thing that you've used to define yourself, you've destroyed yourself. Then again, if you have yourself, and if you have your stuff, and if you don't lose your stuff, you can also just become shallow. You can really believe that life is all about making money, or all about your favorite sports team, all about whatever it is that you've made life all about, and you never think about anything deeper. You never think about how fleeting all that stuff of this life really is. Paul says that's why I don't define myself by that stuff. That's why I don't define myself by myself. I define myself by Christ. That is how we can make sense of who we are. That is how we can have a full life. That is how we can have meaning in life. And that is why we're calling this series Little Letter I. Because here's the deal. Ultimately, I am small. He is big. I am nothing. He is everything. That's why we define ourselves by him. Now, it's this that takes us to our story for today, because we're going to be taking a look at Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, a very famous story, involves a very famous person in the Old Testament named Moses. And we are going to see how Moses is led to ultimately define himself by who God is. And so if you got a Bible, turn to Exodus chapter 3. We're going to start at verse 1. Exodus 3, beginning at verse 1. And we'll just kind of work through the story bit by bit. Exodus 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, which was the mountain of God. I want to pause right there, give you a little bit of context. As the story opens, Moses is tending sheep for his father-in-law. Now, if you remember the story of Moses goes something like this. When Moses is first born, there's a Pharaoh in Egypt where all the Israelites are living, and the Pharaoh in Egypt does not like the Israelites who are living in his land. And so he does two things. Number one, he decides that he's going to enslave all of the Israelites who are living in his land. And then when the Israelites continue to increase in number, the Pharaoh begins to get worried that maybe the Israelites are going to rebel and cause a big problem in the Egyptian empire. And so the Pharaoh issues an edict that all the Israelite boys are to be killed. Now, if you're a mother and you have a son, the last thing you want for your son to do is die. The last thing you want for any of your kids is for them to die. And so Moses' mom does what any self-respecting mother would do. She tries to save her son. The story goes like this. She takes her son, she hides her son in a basket, and she floats her son down the Nile River, where fortuitously her son is found by the daughter of Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh sees that this is a little Israelite baby. And Pharaoh's daughter sees that this is a little Israelite baby. And Pharaoh's daughter has compassion on this little Israelite baby. And Pharaoh's daughter actually raises Moses as her own son. And so Moses has grown up in a life of privilege. He has been raised in the palace of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter. Everything is going along great for Moses until one day, Exodus 2 verse 11, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, the story says, and he watched them doing their hard labor. He saw that an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and so looking this way and that and not seeing anybody, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. Now, he thought that he had gotten away with this, but then verse 13 of Exodus 2 says, the next day he went out and he saw two of the Israelites fighting. He asked the one who was in the wrong, hey, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me just like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? Moses knew that he had been found out. He was afraid, and he thought, what I've done must have become known. And it did become known. It became known all the way to Pharaoh. Exodus 2 verse 15 says, when Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he went to go live in the land of Midian. And this is where Exodus chapter 3 opens. Moses has lost everything that he's had growing up. He's lost the palace that he lived in. He lost the mother that he knew in Pharaoh's daughter. He lost all the perks, all the prestige, all the money, all the comfort that comes with living under Pharaoh in his household. Moses has lost everything. In fact, the fall that Moses takes here is really quite startling. Three things here that I want you to notice about Exodus 3 as it opens, okay? First thing that I want you to notice is that Moses is in the region of Midian. In fact, more than that, he has a father-in-law, verse 1 says, who is a priest of Midian. Now, here's the reason this is important. The Midianites and the Israelites in the Old Testament, they did not get along. They were enemies of each other. In fact, Numbers 25, verse 17, God says to the Israelites, treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them. Now, here's Moses, and he's married this girl who's a Midianite. He's in a Midianite territory. His father-in-law is a Midianite, which means, are the Israelites going to like Moses, yes or no? No. Because he has betrayed his own people, and he has gone out with a Midianite girl. He's married the Midianite girl, whose father is actually a priest in the Midianite religion. And so Moses doesn't really have any sort of home with his own people, the Israelites, but not only that, Moses also does not have any sort of home with the Egyptians by whom he was raised. In fact, notice what Moses is doing. Verse 1, he's tending the flock. You know what that means? Moses is a shepherd. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Egyptians hated shepherds. The Bible actually tells us this. Genesis 46, verse 34. All shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Now, this had to do with the fact that the Egyptians considered sheep to be weak and worthless. We see this even in the Egyptian pantheon of religion. If you look at Egyptian gods, all their gods are based on animals. For example, this is the god Ammit. Now, he has the head of a crocodile, his torso is that of a leopard, and then his backside is that of a hippo. And so we got three animals, one god, another god. This is the god Apis. You know what Apis looks like? A bull. Okay, they even have a god, Bast, very famous, the protector of women and children, and that god is a cat. Why you would want your God to be a cat? I don't know. But the Egyptians were good with their God being a cat. But here's the thing. For all the different animals the Egyptians had in their pantheon of gods, you know what animal they didn't have in their pantheon of gods? They had a cat, but they didn't have a sheep. Because that's how much Egyptians hated sheep. Now here's Moses. He had grown up, for all intents and purposes, as an Egyptian. What is he doing? He is tending sheep. And so not only does Moses not have any place anymore with the Israelites because of the Midianite girl that he's married, he's fallen so far away from his Egyptian upbringing that he's now tending sheep, the animal that the Egyptians hate more than any other animal. But that's not all. Moses has fallen even farther than that. Notice whose sheep he's tending. Verse 1 says he's tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. Here's what that means. Moses may be a shepherd, but he's not really a shepherd. He's just a sheep sitter. Because he didn't even have any sheep of his own. He's tending somebody else's sheep. And so here's the picture. Moses is hated by the Egyptians. Pharaoh wants to kill him. He's become a shepherd. Moses is hated by the Israelites because he's married the enemy. And Moses can't even get a good job. He has to sheep sit for somebody else. Here's the picture. Moses has fallen to the bottom. He's lost everything he's had. And this is great. Now, here's why I say that. As humans, it's a funny thing about us. Sometimes we have a much tougher time understanding who we are when we have a lot of stuff. Because when we have a lot of stuff, we almost reflexively and naturally use that stuff to define who we are. We say things like, I am rich. Our money defines who we are. I am successful. Our successes define who we are. I am important. Our title defines who we are. When we have a lot of stuff, we tend to define ourselves by that stuff. But when we lose all that stuff, then what do we define ourselves by? It's kind of like this. About a week and a half ago, Melody and I went to Colorado to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. And we booked a couple of tickets, flew into Denver. And one of the places that we saw, because both Melody and I are very exciting people, is we did a tour of the Colorado State Capitol. Now, this was fun. It was like the Texas State Capitol, not as cool as the Texas State Capitol, but it was pretty nice. Now, the building is over 100 years old, and so it's under rehabilitation. And so on the outside of the building, this is what the outside of the building looks like. It's all this scaffolding because they're trying to spruce the building up and continue to keep it in good order and in good shape. Now, it's frustrating because I know the scaffolding is needed to help with the building, but you know what the scaffolding hides? The scaffolding hides the building's beauty. That's why the goal at the end of it all is eventually to get rid of the what? To get rid of the scaffolding so you can actually see the building underneath the scaffolding. Okay, all the stuff that we define ourselves by, our riches, our power, our success, our this, our that, ultimately it's scaffolding. And if we use it to define ourselves, we will only hide ourselves. We will only hide the beauty of who God has really created us to be. And that is the value of losing all the scaffolding every once in a while. Because then we got to figure out who we really are without all the stuff that surrounds us. That's why Moses is in the perfect position to discover who he really is, because he's lost all the scaffolding. He's lost all the stuff. And so the story continues, Exodus 3, verse 2 now. There the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought to himself, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to see this strange sight. Why this bush does not burn up. So here's Moses. He's lost everything. All of a sudden, off in the distance, Moses sees this bush. And this bush is burning, but it is not burning up. Now, in order to understand this picture, let me give you a little picture in your head, okay? If I were to take a bush in your front yard, and I were to go over there and light it on fire, if you'd like me to do this so you can see this, I'll do this for you a little bit later today, okay? How long do you think it would take for it to burn up and burn out? 5 minutes? Anybody think 5 minutes? Anybody think 10 minutes? Anybody think 15 minutes? You know, you may have noticed that it's been a little bit cold here for the past couple of days. And so we've been building fires in the McIntosh household. Now, the way that we build fires in the McIntosh household, it does not work like this. I do not go out and chop wood. No. I do not go to H-E-B and buy the prepackaged cedar wood. No, no, no. I go to H-E-B and buy the Presto logs because they're easy to light. Now, they say they burn for 4 hours, but I've seen those suckers burn for longer than that. I've seen them burn for 6. Here's the idea. Sometimes it takes a really long time for something to burn up and burn out. And so here is this burning bush that is off in the distance that Moses sees. Now, if you just glance at it, you know what it looks like? A brush fire, which if you're in the middle of a desert, a brush fire would be a pretty common thing. But Moses not only takes the time to glance at it, he takes the time to watch it. Apparently, there's not a lot going on in the land of Horeb. Because he stares at it and stares at it and stares at it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. And he's thinking, golly, how much brush is in that fire? It's burning, but it's not burning up and burning out. And so finally, Moses' curiosity is piqued enough that he goes over to it to check what's up with it. And that's when the bush starts talking. Exodus 3, verse 4. When the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses goes to the bush starts talking, God is in the bush, and notice how God addresses Moses. He says to Moses, "Moses, Moses." Now, the fact that God says Moses' name twice here is actually important. This is a Semitic way of showing endearment to somebody. Probably the most famous example of this, Jesus goes over to the home of Mary and Martha one day, and Martha decides that she wants to be the hostess with the mostest, because Jesus has come over to her house. And so Martha, she is sweeping, and she is cleaning, and she is vacuuming, and she is dusting, and Jesus is over there, and Martha's scurrying around the kitchen trying to prepare all the food. And you know what her sister Mary's doing? She's just sitting there at the feet of Jesus, listening to Jesus. And finally, Martha, who's doing all the work around the house, trying to make sure that everything is just great for Jesus' visit, gets a little frustrated, and she gets a little jealous of her sister who's doing nothing while she's doing everything. And so Martha goes to Jesus, Luke 10, verse 40, and she says, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Now, how does Jesus answer? He says, "Martha, Martha." Says her name twice. "You're worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is really needed." Now, this is not Jesus scolding Martha. This is Jesus loving Martha. This is Jesus saying to Martha, "You know, my visit doesn't have to be this complicated. You're worried about all these things, but when it really comes down to it, there's only one thing. There's only one thing you got to focus on. There's only one thing you got to look at, and that's me. Just spend time with me." Now, what God says to Martha, God says to Moses, "Moses, Moses." And just to take it a step further, what God says to Moses, God says to you. Very important. When God speaks with you, He speaks with you in the same way that He does with Moses and Martha. He speaks with you out of love for you. That's what this book is all about. This book is all about God's love for sinful people. God speaks with love for you. And so God speaks with love for Moses, and look at what He says to Moses. He says in verse 5, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Now, to get at this request from God to Moses, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground," I want to show you a picture. This is a picture of a mosque in the Middle East, and there are two things here that I want you to notice about this picture. Just first of all, to get it out of the way, that kid is really cute, right? Okay, that's the first thing you've noticed. We've all noticed that. Okay, second thing that I want you to notice, okay? We got all of these Muslim men who are praying, and notice what they're not wearing. They're not wearing any shoes. Okay, because in the East, even today, when you go into a so-called holy place, you know what you do? You remove your shoes. Here's why. If you are walking through Middle Eastern streets, you know what gets all over your shoes? Dust and dirt and grime. You're going into a holy place. You're going into a sacred place. You're going into a clean place. And you don't want to track all the dust and dirt and grime from that holy place into from the common place into a place like this. And so you take off your shoes. It's kind of like sometimes if you go over to somebody's house who is really uptight, what do? They ask you to take off your shoes. We do at our house. Why? You don't want dust and dirt and grime all over the house. Now, here's the funny thing about God's request to Moses, right? God says to Moses, take off your sandals, your shoes, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Where is Moses? It's not like he's just walked into a church somewhere where the floors have just been buffed and the cleaning staff doesn't want Moses' sandals scuffing up their floor, right? Moses is in the middle of the what? Desert. Okay, you know what Moses has on his shoes? Dust and dirt. You know what's right there by that bush? Dust and dirt. So what's the difference? Why would Moses take off his shoes? It's not like taking off his shoes is going to keep the holy place any cleaner. Here's the point. This holy ground that God talks to Moses about, this holy ground is holy not because it's cleaner than some other place, not because it's more glitzy or glamorous than some other place, not because it has a big steeple on it and some other place doesn't. This holy ground is holy not because of the ground itself, but because of who is at the ground. He's the one who makes the ground holy. He's the one who makes the ground special. This holy ground is holy because of God. Now, this kind of begs the question. If God is what makes holy ground holy, where is God? Great poet, her name is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, famous English poet from the 1800s. This is what she says, one of my favorite quotes. Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush is afire with God. You know, the story of Moses teaches us something about holy ground. It teaches us something about where God is in our lives. God can be anywhere and everywhere in our lives. Why? Because earth can be crammed with heaven. Any bush can be a burning bush. Any place can be a place that you stop and speak with God. Any moment can be a moment when you take the time to worship God. Any spot can be a spot where you encounter God. The Bible puts it like this, Isaiah 6 verse 3. This is a song that angels sing in heaven. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory. Where is holy ground? Just look around. That's where holy ground is. And so here's Moses. And he is encountering God in probably what had to be the most unexpected place ever. But God can show up in unexpected ways, in unexpected places, because every piece of ground can be a holy piece of ground. And so God is getting ready to have this conversation with Moses. And what God says to Moses is pretty incredible. Exodus 3 verse 6, God says to Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, the text says, because he was afraid to look at God. Here's what God does when He starts talking to Moses. God begins by introducing Himself. Now notice how He introduces Himself. He says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, here's the reason this is so important, okay? Apart from their relationship with God, how many of us would know anything about these guys? Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob? If these guys weren't in the Bible, would we know much about them? Yes or no? No. Would we probably know anything about them? Yes or no? No. Okay, here's the reason that's important. These guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the reason that we remember them, the reason that we study them, the reason that we celebrate them, the reason that we look at them, the reason that we talk about them really has nothing to do with them. It has to do with their relationship with God. These guys are well known not because they were really good guys in and of themselves, because they weren't. These guys are well known, not because they were super successful guys in and of themselves, because they weren't. These guys are known for one reason. These guys are known because of God. These guys are known because of the relationship that they had with God. Question, if you're going to be known for something, what do you want to be known for? If you're going to be remembered for something, what do you want to be remembered for? You want to be known for your money? You want to be known for your success? You want to be known for your career? I know a few of you want to be known for your dashing good looks. Maybe your health habits. Maybe your morality. Maybe you want to be known for being a really good person. Tell you what, in the big scheme of things, none of that really matters. The best thing to be known for is the thing for which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are known for, which is not themselves at all. They're known for their relationship with God. In 2013, Time Magazine compiled a list of the 100 most significant figures in history. Okay, I'll give you one simple guess. This is not hard. This is the Sunday school answer. The number one most significant figure in history, according to Time Magazine, was Jesus. Everything else, everyone else, falls under him. What you're known for doesn't matter unless you're known for being with him. In fact, it's kind of funny looking down that list from 2013, because you know who else is on that list? The Apostle Paul. Why is the Apostle Paul known? Because of his missionary journeys, because he was a follower of what? Jesus. Okay, you know who else is on that list? Martin Luther. Why are we still talking about Martin Luther? Well, he initiated a reformation of the church that was all about who? Jesus. John Calvin, another one of the great reformers of the church who came just a little bit after Martin Luther. You know, John Calvin wrote these great works of theology, and they were all centered on one person. Who was that one person? Jesus. Constantine, the great emperor of Rome, was also on that list. We would not remember Constantine, but he was converted to believing in Jesus. Or how about St. Augustine? He's on that list too. Now, St. Augustine wrote these great works, The City of God and The City of Man. He was one of the great theologians of the church. And you know what all his theology focused on? Okay. Why are all these guys known? They're all known because of the guy at the top of the list. Who's Jesus? You see, this is how history rises and falls. It rises and falls not on the stuff that we do, not on the accolades that we achieve, not on the good people that we are. It rises and falls on Jesus, God's Son. That's what so many of the people on this list are known for. What do you want to be known for? In the way that God introduces himself to Moses, we get a glimpse of what we should want to be known for. We should want to be known for how we relate to God through his Son, Jesus. God continues, Exodus 3, verse 7, he says, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land that is flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. God continues in his conversation with Moses, and God says, okay, your people, the Israelites, they have a problem. They are suffering under the oppressive rule and reign of the Egyptians. Now, notice the verbs that God uses when he talks about this oppression. Verse 7 of Exodus 3, God says, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. Here's the idea: God is watching. Okay, he's been watching the Israelites. He sees what is going on. He has his eye on them. But not only does he see, God continues, I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. So not only does God have his eye on them, he also has his ear to the ground. He's listening to them, which, by the way, says something profound about the power of prayer, right? Here are the Israelites. They're not even uttering any formal prayers. They're just crying out. They're just complaining, and yet God is listening. Their cries have reached his ears. And then my favorite verb, the last of the three, I am concerned about their suffering. Now, I want you to pick up on this verb, concerned. In Hebrew, this is the word yada. It means to know something, but it doesn't just mean to know something in a detached intellectual or academic sense. It means to know something in a personal sense. Another way that this is often translated is the word familiar. In other words, you know something because you experience something. The prophet Isaiah says there's going to be this great servant of God who's going to come, and he's going to die for the sins of the world. And one of the things Isaiah says about this servant is that he is going to be, Isaiah 53, verse 3, despised and rejected by mankind. He's going to be a man of suffering, and he's going to be familiar with pain. Hebrew word for familiar is the word yada. To yada something is to know something by experience, to know something because you've gone through something. Now, one of the questions that I get most often as a pastor is this: if God is really loving, if he really does care about us, why is there so much pain and why is there so much suffering in the world? Now, I'll tell you right up front, I don't have a full answer to this question, but here's what I can tell you. I do know that even if God does not get rid of all the pain and suffering in this world, he does care about the pain and suffering in this world. You know why? Because he goes through the pain and the suffering of this world. How do I know that? Because God yadas the Israelite suffering. He's familiar with it. God doesn't just sit back on a cloud somewhere and say, oh, I'm sorry, that must be tough. Better luck next time. God comes to be with us. He suffers with us. He's in the trenches for us. In fact, it's so interesting. Notice what God says. I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering. Exodus 3, verse 8. Then what does God say? So I have come down. I'm going to come into the pain of the Israelites. I'm going to be in the pain of the Israelites. God may not knock out all suffering, at least not yet. That day is coming, but not quite yet. But he's with us in suffering. Now, in the case of the Israelites, God is in fact planning on rescuing them. Exodus 3, verses 9 and 10, God says, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So, now, Moses, go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God knows the Israelites are hurting, so God is going to come down and rescue them, but there's a catch. God is going to come down and rescue them through Moses. That's why God says in verse 10, I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. You know, I was thinking about this. God's promises are great promises, aren't they? Promises of rescue and love, restoration, salvation. They're really nice promises until his promises involve us. Okay? Until his promises call on us to be used by him. Then all of a sudden we can get a little squirrely about his promises. Let me give you an example of this. One of my favorite promises in the Bible. 1 Timothy 2 verse 4. God wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Isn't that a nice promise? I mean, really, who in here wants a bunch of people to be condemned? It's nice that God wants all people to be saved. That's a promise that God makes. Here's the question. How does God get that promise? We always read 1 Timothy 2 verse 4, but sometimes we don't read the verses that come right before that. Here's how God makes that promise come to pass. 1 Timothy 2 verse 1, Paul's writing to Timothy and he says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings, and for all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior, then verse 4, because he wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Here's how God is going to get his message to all people so they can be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. God is going to get his message to all people through you. Through the prayers that you offer, through the life that you live, through the witness that you show. How's your witness? You see, this is where the promises of God can get a little bit dicey, because if we're honest with ourselves, we're not always so into being the best witnesses, right? We're scared we're going to be rejected. We're scared we're going to be ridiculed. We're scared we're going to be persecuted. We love the promises of God, God saving people, loving people, rescuing people, redeeming people, as long as God doesn't want to work his promises through us. Now, if that's you, if that's the way you feel, let me give you a little good news, okay? You're not the only one. It's funny, God makes these great promises. I'm going to rescue my people Israel. I'm going to lead them out of their slavery in Egypt. Moses is fine with that until the promise involves him. Because now all of a sudden Moses begins to get a little scared and a little worried. Exodus 3 verse 11, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses says to God, wait just a minute, you want to use me to do your work? I'm not so sure about that. I don't know if I have the chops to pull this off. I don't know if I have the talent to make this happen. Now, you want to know a secret? Moses doesn't. He's a failure. I mean, look at his life. It's a wreck. The Israelites hate him because he's married a Midianite girl. The Egyptians hate him. He's tending sheep. He can't even provide for himself. He doesn't even own anything. Doesn't even have any sheep. He has to sheep sit for his father-in-law. Moses, by all accounts, is a failure. But it's a funny thing about the way that God works. God doesn't always work through the best and the brightest. God is just fine drafting failures. People who can't pull it together and hold it together. Because here's the thing, God doesn't really need human talent to shine. God is just looking for a willing heart through which to work. Moses is not so sure about being used by God, and so God says to him, Exodus 3, verse 12, I'm going to be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you're going to worship me, God says, on this mountain. Now, the mountain that Moses is at is called Horeb. We see that in Exodus 3, verse 1. Moses comes to Horeb, which is the mountain of God. Now, Horeb has another name. We know it better by its other name. Horeb is also called Sinai. Remember something that happened at Sinai? Moses got these 2 stone tablets, and on the stone tablets were what? They were 10 commandments. In other words, Moses, later in the story of the Exodus, does make it back to the mountain to worship God, just like God says in Exodus chapter 3. I also want you to follow the pronouns in this verse, Exodus 3, verse 12. God says, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. There are two yous in verse 12. The first you is singular. That's Moses. When you, Moses, bring the people out of Egypt, but the second you is plural. It's y'all in Hebrew. Will worship God on this mountain. Here's what God is saying to Moses. I know you don't think this. I know you don't believe this. I know you're scared of this, but you're going to be successful in this. The next time you come to this mountain, it's not just going to be you. It's going to be y'all. You're not going to be alone. You're going to have the whole nation of Israel with you. Trust me, I got this for you, Moses. Listen to me because I want to work through you. Now, Moses is still not quite convinced. And so Moses says to God, Exodus 3, verse 13, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Moses goes to God and he says, hey, what if I go to the Israelites and I say to them, well, God told me I'm going to lead you out of your slavery. God told me I'm going to rescue you from your oppression. And the Israelites say, well, what's this God's name again? Now, this would have been a natural question to ask in the ancient world because the ancient world was essentially a polytheistic world, right? Everybody had their own little gods and goddesses, kind of like the Egyptian pantheon of gods. Ammit, Apis, Bast, a lot of other gods in there as well. And here's what you need to know about these gods. All of these gods were regional. In other words, they each had their own little territories, their own little domains. You had the god of the sea, and the god of the fish, and the god of the women and children, and the god of the Nile, and the god of this, and the god of that. They all just ruled over their own little certain individual things. And so when Moses comes to the Israelites and he says, God has sent me to you, the Israelites would naturally ask, wait, we've heard of a lot of gods since we've been here in Egypt. What God are you talking about? What is this God's name? And God says, okay, here's my name. I am who I am. Now here's what God means by that name. In a world that has all these gods and goddesses, and they rule over all of these different domains, all of these different territories, all of these different parts of existence, God says to Moses, I don't just rule over one little corner of existence, I am existence. I am the very foundation, the ground of existence. I am the reason that everything that exists actually does exist. I am the cause of existence itself. Not just one little God who has one little name and rules over one little part of existence. I just am. Which means I incorporate everything into me, God says. Now, it's this that takes us to ourselves and how we define ourselves, because here's the deal. If God is I am, if God is the very ground of existence, if God is the foundation of existence, then if we exist, who do we have to thank for that? We have to thank God. Can we have an existence apart from God? Yes or no? Nope, not according to Exodus 3. And so our existence, the fact that we are, has to be connected to the fact that God is. Our I ams have to be connected to the great I am. Now, how do you live with an existence like that? How do you live like it is true that who you are is connected to who God is, that your I am is connected to the great I am? In the few minutes that we have remaining, let me just give you 3 ways to kind of get comfortable with that notion and to live like that is true. First way to do that is this. Start to get honest about your failures. Start to get honest about your failures. If you look at Moses, he was a loser. He had no home, no career, no future, no people. And yet God used him in a powerful way that we still remember to this day. If it wasn't for God, would we be talking about Moses today? Nope. Everything that Moses is, every reason that we remember him, it's all connected to the great I am. Now, here's the reason this is so important. We live in a society, we live in a world that loves to define itself and derive its value from its success. The problem is, if you don't succeed and you fail, then what do? Because now you got nothing by which to define yourself. Now in our world, in our day, in our age, here's how we fix this when we fail. We try to cover our failure up, right? It's kind of like this. One of the movies that I watched as a kid was Pee-wee's Great Adventure, about a misfit guy who actually winds up visiting the Alamo right here in San Antonio. He learns the Alamo doesn't have a basement. Now, there's this one scene near the beginning of the movie where Pee-wee's riding his bike, and he hits something, and he tumbles off his bike, and there are these kids who are watching him, and immediately Pee-wee picks himself up, he brushes himself off, and he looks at these kids, and you know what he says? I meant to do that. And that's the way so many of us live, even as adults. We mess up, we fall, but we're so obsessed with defining ourselves by our success that we pick ourselves up, we brush ourselves off, and we say, I meant to do that. It wasn't really a failure. No, I only succeed. Okay, God's name invites us to get honest about our failures. Because we are not defined by our failures, we are defined by His promises. And so we can get honest about our failures. We can get honest about our hurts. We can get honest about our mess-ups. We can get honest about our misgivings. We can get honest about our pain. If you don't, you're just going to define yourself by your success even when you know you failed. So get honest about your failure. That's the first way to get comfortable defining yourself by God. Second way to get comfortable defining yourself by God is also to get honest about your successes. Okay? It's so tempting to try to cover up your failures because you want to be a success, but when you actually do succeed, when you actually do something well, when something does go according to plan, here's the temptation then, to gloat. Now, if that's you, here's what you need to understand. Your achievements, your accolades, your accomplishments, all that stuff that you would like to gloat about, you know what it amounts to? Now, if you don't believe me, I'll give you the Bible verse, okay? Ecclesiastes 2, verse 11. When I surveyed, Solomon says near the end of his life, all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, it was all meaningless. Chasing after the wind. Nothing was really gained under the sun. That's the truth of our existence. Even our successes, if you put them in the big scheme of things, not really worth much. There's an atheist professor of philosophy at NYU. His name is Thomas Nagel, and he actually hits this on the head. He sees that all of our successes really don't amount to much of anything. I read this quote a couple of weeks ago, but it's worth reading again. Thomas Nagel writes, perhaps you've had the thought that nothing really matters because in 200 years we'll all be dead. That's true. Even if you produce a great work of literature which continues to be read thousands of years from now, eventually the solar system will cool or the universe will wind down or collapse, and all traces of your efforts are going to vanish. There seems to be no point to it at all. Looking at it from the outside, it wouldn't matter if you had never existed. And after you've gone out of existence, it won't matter that you did exist. That's kind of a happy thought, don't you think? But it's true if you define yourself by your success. Puts it in perspective. Even your greatest achievement, even your greatest advancement, even your greatest accolade in the big scheme of things, it all fails and falls. If you want to count for something, You can't define yourself by your success. So, how do you define yourself? You live for someone who's more than you. You live for someone who's greater than you and better than you and longer lasting than you, bigger than you. You live for God. Remember how God introduces himself to Moses. He says in verse 6, I'm the God of your father. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That's what makes their lives count. That's what makes their lives amount to something, that I'm their God. And that's what can make your life count too, that he is your God. That's finally what made Moses' life count, that this was Moses' God. In fact, part of what makes this story so compelling is the fact that God really does want to relate to us. God really did want to relate to Moses. Here's how I know this, okay? God went out of his way to relate to Moses. Notice, when God is first introduced to us in Exodus chapter 3, he's not introduced to us as God. He's actually called in verse 2, the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Then in verse 4, it says that God is actually the angel. He's the one who called to Moses from within the bush. So this angel is not just any old angel who appears to Moses in this bush. This angel is God himself. Now, usually, when God comes into contact with somebody like you or like me, with a person, you know what happens to that person? Right? In fact, God actually says this to Moses a little bit later in the book of Exodus, Exodus 33, verse 20. God says to Moses, you cannot see my face, for nobody may see me and live. If you come into direct contact with God, you're done. When Isaiah sees God in Isaiah chapter 6, he gets a glimpse into the throne room of heaven, and he sees God there on the throne. You know what Isaiah says? Isaiah 6, verse 5, woe to me, for I am ruined. That's what happens. Isaiah knows it. Even when Moses finally figures out that it's God who's talking to him from the burning bush, notice what Exodus 3 verse 6 says. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And yet, Moses sees God, he talks with God, and he lives to tell about it. Moses' encounter with God does not destroy him. It actually helps him. You know why? Because Moses doesn't just see God. Moses sees God in the form of this angel of the Lord. And it's funny, the angel of the Lord, he's God, and yet he's a God who doesn't destroy. He's a God who helps. He's a God who gives. He's a God who saves. Psalm 34, verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. That's what this appearance of God does. He's a God who delivers. There's a commentator, his name is Alec Moitier, and he describes these appearances by the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament like this, because we see lots of these appearances, and these appearances never destroy people, they always help people. Alec Moitier says, the angel is revealed as the merciful accommodation of God, whereby the Lord can be present among a sinful people. When were he to go with them himself, his presence would inevitably consume them. We can put it like this, okay? The angel suffers no reduction or adjustment of his full deity. He's still God, yet he's that mode of God whereby the holy God can keep company with sinners. A God who hangs out with people who are sinful and broken. Who does that sound like to you? It sounds like Jesus to me. You see, that's why Moses is remembered, because he met God and God didn't destroy him, because God came for him in a way that loved him. God comes for you and me in a way that loves you and me. And that's the reason we don't have to worry about being something. That's the reason we don't have to worry about defining ourselves by our achievements, by our accolades, by our accomplishments, by our stuff, by our money, by our fame, our success. None of that makes us something. You know, it's so interesting. We live in a world that's obsessed with being something. Jesus comes, and you know what Philippians 2 verse 7 says? Jesus comes, and when he does, he makes himself nothing. And yet, because he makes himself nothing, we receive everything, even eternal life, forgiveness of sins, and salvation. Why would you want to define yourself by anyone else but him? Who are you trying to be? Trying to be rich? Trying to be powerful? Trying to be famous? Or successful? Trying to be moral? As you seek those things, I want you to remember this. Jesus came for you not because you were something. He came for you even though you had nothing but your sin. And because he came for you, not to destroy you, but to save you, you have everything. And because he came for you, that is proof for you that you matter and you count. And your life means something. Live for the one who makes it mean something. Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you've revealed yourself to us in a way that doesn't destroy us but actually saves us. We thank you that you've come for us to show us who we really are. And we're not the sum total of the stuff that we do, the accolades that we achieve, the accomplishments that we have, the money that we make. That doesn't define us at all. You do. And your Son's cross does. May we find rest, comfort, hope, and joy in that, even as we find rest, comfort, hope, and joy in him. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Have a good week. Walk with light.